A sudden spike in our electricity bill had me rushing to call the power company. An employee arrived looking puzzled and asked if I had noticed a particular wire before. When David and I went over to check, the employee gently moved a nearby potted plant, revealing a strange wire extending from our outdoor outlet towards my in-laws' house. "Do you know anything about this wire?" the employee asked. David and I exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. "Hey, David, could this be why our electric bill went through the roof?" I asked. David nodded and instinctively reached for the outlet, swiftly unplugging the wire. The very next moment, a sharp scream echoed from my in-laws' direction. It was probably my mother-in-law. Soon after, I heard some hysterical muttering growing louder and coming from behind their door. Suddenly, my mother-in-law burst out from the bushes. My name is Freya Thompson, a 32-year-old stay-at-home mum with a passion for trying out limited-time desserts. I gather information about these treats through friends or my own research. David, my kind husband, always supports my hobbies. I've known David since college, and I've always adored his consistent kindness. I also have a deep fondness for my in-laws who raised such a wonderful man. Many of my married friends complain about their mothers-in-law, and I've heard stories of marriages ending because of these issues. Thankfully, such tales have nothing to do with our household. My mother-in-law, like me, loves desserts, and she's always delighted when I bring her a recommended treat. My father-in-law, though a man of few words, always has a reassuring smile. Both of them have always been fond of me, and I feel the same about them. My in-laws live about a 30-minute drive away, just the right distance. Sometimes I wonder if we could live together. Not that I want to, but maybe we'd get along better than expected. I adore them enough to entertain such thoughts. However, I've come to realize that life isn't always that sweet. One day, David told me surprising news. "Your parents are moving into the vacant house next door," he said. I had always assumed they owned their place, but it turns out they were renting. Their house had gotten old, and when they found out about the empty house next to ours, they jumped on the opportunity. This sudden short-distance habitation immediately consumed me with anxiety. Up until now, I had gotten along with my in-laws without any issues. Living next door means we could see each other every day if we wanted. I do like my in-laws, but to be honest, seeing them daily is a bit much. I can't just tell them it's too close and ask them not to move here. When we first heard about the move, David gently advised his parents, "Maybe you shouldn't," but they didn't want to hear it. "We get along so well now, it'll be fine," they said. "I thought we could even live together." Looking back, I want to smack my overly optimistic self for thinking that way. As my anxiety grew, my in-laws moved in. At first, things seemed okay. We maintained a good distance and set some boundaries. But as they settled in, my mother-in-law began to push those boundaries. She started dropping by without calling ahead, acting like it was her own house. They seemed to be checking our every move. One day, my mother-in-law paid an unannounced visit and checked on our dinner. She said something outrageous. "Hey, Mary, I've been thinking, maybe you could stop locking the door." I couldn't believe my ears. In this day and age, suggesting we leave our house unlocked? Not locking the door means not knowing who could walk in at any time. It's obviously a bad idea. Ever since my mother-in-law moved nearby, even the doorbell ringing makes my heart race. Now there's the possibility she could just walk into our home without us knowing. I'm certainly not okay with that. I tried to keep things light and declined with a smile, but she frowned and replied, "Oh, Mary, you're such a worrier. Don't fret. I'll tell our neighbours to look out for you. And don't forget, your father-in-law and I are here too. We'll be popping in frequently." I understand her words come from a good place, and I appreciate that. That's why I couldn't bring myself to tell her how burdensome her frequent visits had become. but everyone has their limits. Last week it felt like she had perfect attendance at our home. I have tea with my mother-in-law every day. Naturally, spending this much time together, some grievances arise. I've come to truly understand that a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship is all about the right distance. She would leave unnecessary potted plants in our yard or plant flowers without asking. It's like she does whatever she wants. If it was once every few months, I could tolerate it, but every day is a different story. Since the locking incident, she's brought it up several times. I managed to convince her by saying I was just a wife with strong security concerns. However, with that settled, my mother-in-law then started pleading, "I'd like a spare key." I knew I had to get David to refuse her request. Handing such a powerful item to her now is just out of the question. Though I found myself at odds with her behaviour, I didn't quite dislike her. She can be meddlesome, but I know it comes from her good intentions. Rather, I felt more guilt for rejecting her than anything else. But as time passed, those feelings began to change. Whether it was me changing, my mother-in-law changing, or both, I can't be sure. However, I started to feel discomfort and irritation with her comments. A few months after she moved in, it had become routine for my mother-in-law to visit after lunch. I once asked about my father-in-law, and it seems he usually goes for walks or shopping alone. I suggested she join him, but she declined, saying, "Walking tires me out." Lately, she's become a typical mother-in-law. Previously, when I made her tea, she'd just say, "Thank you." But now there's always a comment like, "It's too warm," or "It's too weak." Whenever she speaks, it's either gossip or bad-mouthing someone. Being around her just brings me down, but I can't exactly reject her, so I just nod and force a smile. Today, my mother-in-law was fervently discussing a neighbour's consistently neglected yard. "So I was saying," when my mother-in-law suddenly stopped talking. I instinctively followed her gaze to the bookshelf. Did she find a book that piqued her interest? It would be peaceful if we could just read together. "Did you find a book you're interested in?" I asked as I approached the bookshelf. She reached past it, grabbing something from the rack next to it. "Aria, you shouldn't touch that," I said. Upon seeing what she took, I hastily reached out, but she innocently opened it and exclaimed with delight, "Oh my, Mary dear, didn't you overspend last month? Goodness, your electricity bill is twice as much as ours." What my mother-in-law was looking at, as if she were reading a weekly magazine, was our household account book. "Stop! Give it back!" I shouted as I snatched the book away. My mother-in-law laughed softly. "You really don't have to be so flustered, Mary. It seems like you're not very good at saving money. David must feel bad having a wife who struggles with budgeting. You should try a bit harder, okay?" I could feel my face heat up. The front and back covers clearly stated household account book, yet she still opened it. I couldn't believe it. She continued, "I have a soft spot for limited edition treats too, so I get the urge. But if you can't even save a dime, do you think you really deserve to indulge in sweets? You spend way too much on food, and the electricity bill is outrageous." She then boasted about how frugal she was. After her rant, she seemed satisfied and left. Once she was gone, I couldn't stop crying. The accumulated stress had taken its toll. I cried non-stop until David came home. "You don't have to take Mum's word for it," he said, "but I think it's easier said than done. I'm really sorry. I'll tell Mum not to come again." "Yeah, please," I replied. David comforted me, and once I calmed down, I decided to discuss something that had been bothering me, the electricity bill. My mother-in-law was right. It had been high without any significant changes in our usage. It had skyrocketed over the past few months. I was concerned, but dealing with my mother-in-law had left me little time to think about anything else. David looked at the electricity bill details, puzzled. This is definitely strange. I know, right? The next bill is coming soon. If it seems off, we should call the electric company. A few days later, a bill arrived, charging us an astonishing $1,300, more than double our usual amount. Feeling that something was amiss, we decided to have someone from the electric company come over. The technician took a detailed look around, then pointed out something peculiar. "Did you know about this wire?" he asked as David and I approached. The technician gently moved a potted plant to make it visible. It was hidden by the long leaves, but there was an external outlet we'd forgotten about since we'd never used it. From that outlet, a wire extended towards my in-laws' house. "Do you know anything about this wire?" the technician asked. David and I exchanged glances, both likely thinking the same thing. "Hey, David, could this be—" "Yeah, no doubt about it. This is why our electric bill shot up." To be sure, we followed the wire with the technician, pushing through bushes and tall weeds. Sure enough, the wire led to my in-laws' storage shed. We couldn't see where it connected from there, but it was clear it had something to do with their house. The technician, with a stern look, asked, "Do you want me to call the police?" "No, we might have to, but let's talk it out first. This house belongs to our parents, after all." Realizing it was a family matter, the worker's expression softened with relief. "Oh, I see. I'll be on my way then." "Yes, thank you for taking the time to come out here. We really appreciate it." We walked him out to his vehicle and saw him off. After he left, we turned to each other, deep in thought. David sighed heavily, cradling his head in his hands. "I'm sorry for having a mother like that." "It's hard to say. Don't worry about it. What are we going to do next? If it's like any other day, your parents are probably home right now. Should we confront them directly, or come up with a plan first?" David, with his hand covering his mouth, started walking towards the external outlet. Thanks to the employee who had moved the potted plant aside earlier, the outlet was clearly visible. "Come to think of it, perhaps your mother purposefully placed the potted plant here to hide this outlet. Though I hate to suspect I couldn't think of any other reason. I wondered what the wire was connected to." Suddenly David reached out and swiftly unplugged it. "Wait, is it okay to unplug that?" I asked. "I just unplugged it," David said, anger in his voice. "Thinking of them calmly stealing our electricity all this time makes me so angry. Anyway, we have the employee as a witness. I won't let them make any excuses." "True," I nodded in agreement. Suddenly a high-pitched scream rang out from David's parents' house, likely my mother-in-law. Moments later, hysterical muttering was heard as the voices came closer. With great momentum, my mother-in-law burst out from behind the hedge. "What?" she exclaimed. She must not have expected anyone to be there. "What are you doing in a place like that?" she snapped at us. I puffed up my chest and responded, "Aria, do you have some business in our yard? You seemed pretty flustered." "Well, that's—" She looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Beyond her, David was holding on to the removed wire firmly. My mother-in-law tried to snatch it from his hand, but David twisted away, hiding the wire behind his back. "Hey, what are you doing?" "No, that's what I should be asking you," David said, thrusting the wire in front of her face. "This was plugged into our outlet, you know." My mother-in-law's eyes darted around before she looked upwards defensively. "So what? Do you know where this wire goes?" "I have no idea. Just plug it back in. Things are a mess here since you pulled it out." How could she ask to plug it in without knowing where it's connected to? Plus, she was basically admitting she suffered because it was unplugged. It was almost like she was confessing, but my mother-in-law didn't seem guilty, just panicked. I knew why she was so flustered. Standing next to David, I smiled reassuringly. "Aria, please calm down. How can we plug in a wire when we don't know where it leads?" "This is our outlet, isn't it? It's no big deal to plug it in, just for a moment, please." Oh, Arya, remember what you told me, not to waste even a bit of electricity saying how David was unfortunate to have a wife who couldn't even save on electricity. Well, that was... She started to fidget. I won't make it in time, she muttered under her breath, on the verge of panicking. What time is it now? It's 9:57. Oh no, I'm done for, she exclaimed, then hurriedly stumbled away. David was puzzled by her strange behaviour, but I knew the reason. I whispered to David, explaining, is that what you mean? So if we keep hanging around like this, she'll show up again. That's right. David tossed the wire aside and we headed back inside the house. A short while later I heard a rattling sound at the front door, followed by the doorbell ringing. I knew it was my mother-in-law. I unlocked the door and opened it. Hello, Arya. Enough of your chatter. Move over, she said, pushing me aside as she entered, visibly upset. Her footsteps thundered like a monster's as she made her way to the living room, then heavily flopped onto the sofa. David, in the living room, furrowed his brows with a puzzled expression, about to speak, but my mother-in-law was quicker. Oh, I'm parched. Hey, is the tea not ready yet? You're so slow. Act before being told. That's basic etiquette, right? Yes, I stammered. And another thing, why do you always lock the door? Everyone in the neighbourhood says I have a cold daughter-in-law. There's nothing worth stealing in this house anyway. It's just so pretentious. It's annoying. What? She continued to grumble. I can't stand it any more. I grabbed a half-drunk plastic bottle nearby and slammed it down on the table in front of her. She sat there, eyes wide and frozen in shock. Mary, here's your water. And you said there's nothing worth stealing in this house, but sadly, there are greedy and sneaky people out there. For example, people who sneak and steal electricity, I said, and I could see the panic on my mother-in-law's face. I sat right next to her, but she didn't have the courage to look at me. She stared straight ahead, her face pale. Mary, what's wrong? You don't seem like yourself. Really, Arya? Even I have my limits. Did you think I was a god or something? I tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but she looked as frightened as if she had seen a demon. My mother-in-law asked David for help, but he just shook his head. Given the circumstances, my mother-in-law's next move was predictable. I'm sorry, I remembered that I have something to do, so I'm going to go. You're not going anywhere, I said, pushing her shoulder hard as she tried to get up. She sank back into the sofa. Mary, I really need to... You were the one who said you were thirsty, weren't you? You made such a fuss, and now you say you can't drink water. That's pretty hypocritical, don't you think? Tears filled her eyes as she reached for her bottle, but this time David stopped her. She seemed relieved for a moment, but she didn't want me to drink the leftover. The real problem begins now. When did you start stealing our electricity? You often accuse me of stealing. That's a terrible thing to say. But the wire that's plugged into my outlet actually comes from your house, right? My mother-in-law couldn't come up with a good excuse. She opened and closed her mouth several times, trying to bluff her way out of the situation. To be honest, she had no way out of this. All she had to do was admit it and apologise. Then fate threw her a lifeline. The doorbell rang. When I went to see who it was my father-in-law. Is Arya here? He asked. Apparently he had gone out for a bit of shopping, and when he returned home, the front door was unlocked, and the TV was still on, but his wife was nowhere to be seen. He must have been worried. Seeing her lifeline, my mother-in-law ran to him, tears streaming down her face. My father-in-law seemed quite embarrassed by his wife's distraught appearance. David stepped in and explained everything from the start. After thinking for a while, my father-in-law began to speak slowly. Isn't there some kind of mistake? Of course, he would find it hard to believe that his own wife had been secretly stealing electricity from their son's house. Then who did the wiring? Do you think a complete stranger would go through the trouble of connecting someone else's wiring to another person's house?" My father-in-law crossed his arms, deep in thought. He nodded and said, "Let's go and have a look," and stood up. But my mother-in-law, clearly flustered, tried to intervene. However, my father-in-law asked David to show him what was happening and walked towards the power outlet. The wiring trailed off into a storage shed and couldn't be seen from where we stood. When my father-in-law investigated and returned, the colour had drained from his face. "I'm so sorry, I truly am. Apologise to them now," he told my mother-in-law. "I'm sorry," she muttered, like a child. And my father-in-law explained that the wires led to a battery connected to my mother-in-law's computer via an extension cord. The battery had been purchased when she moved to their new house. Apparently, a salesman told her it was cost-effective to store electricity during the cheaper nighttime hours and then use it during the day. She used our outlet to store electricity at night and used it in her home during the day. At first, she only used the extension cord to plug in her computer and other home appliances. Eventually, she started receiving electricity from our house all day, not just at night. My mother-in-law justified her actions by saying, "I heard it was more economical." Naturally, I was annoyed that she was stealing electricity without permission. What made me even angrier was her constant criticism and belittling of me while lying the entire time. "You often said how David is so unlucky to have a wife who can't save money, and how I buy sweets but can't save a dime, didn't you?" I confronted her. Her lack of remorse was considerable. "Just saving money on your electricity bill by using someone else's electricity doesn't mean you're saving money. That's just theft," I continued. "And just so you know, I won't let this slide just because we're family. If you don't sincerely apologise, we'll have no choice but to involve the police." My mother-in-law looked surprised. Did she think she could pull it off? "What a wife you are! Are you saying that you would betray your own family?" "Don't twist things. We're a family and we just want to make sure things are right." When I took out my phone, she panicked and rushed towards me, but David immediately stopped her. "Evidence! You have no evidence," she stammered. "With all this evidence, do we need more? If so, let us provide you with something more conclusive." I pointed towards the roof. My mother-in-law strained her eyes to see, then her face paled. Our house had security cameras, and by sheer coincidence, the area around the outlet was within the camera's range. My mother-in-law let out a soft cry of distress. "Is this enough proof?" "Oh, one more thing. Is there more?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Today was the release date for the limited edition dessert, so you were in a big hurry, right?" "No way," she muttered. I flashed her a cheeky smile. "Yes, I had a friend buy it for me, so I was able to secure it safely. If you hadn't been so obsessed with siphoning electricity, you might have been able to buy it online." "What a shame." My mother-in-law fell to the ground, trembling and helpless. After talking with David, we decided not to report her to the police. She admitted her wrongdoing, and we had evidence, but it was more troublesome than anything. Since she was a family, there was a chance it would be ignored. Instead, we decided to have my in-laws pay for the electricity they used and additional compensation for the inconvenience. Living in close quarters meant things were bound to get awkward, but that determination was necessary for my peace of mind. My in-laws seemed to feel the tension as our interactions decreased. One day we received some happy news. They were returning to their old house. Apparently, rumours of electricity theft were spreading, especially about my mother-in-law. She got quite upset and started crying, saying she wanted to go back to her previous house. I thought she had good relations with her neighbours, but it turns out she did not. She was just being treated like a fragile object. After paying us and the moving expenses, My in-laws were left lamenting that they were out of money. However, we're absolutely not going to help them out. I hope they cut back on their beloved sweets and manage on their own. On the other hand, now that my mother-in-law is gone, I've been living life to the fullest every single day. Our electric bill has significantly reduced, and I'm currently debating which dessert to treat myself to next.